This is the Balancing Act by Security Compass, your guide to going fast while staying safe in today's digital world.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our podcast. Today, we have our guest, Michael Isbitski. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Altes. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. Michael, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about your background, how you ended up where you are, how you're like some of the things that you're doing with Salt Security. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Mike Isbitski. I'm a technical evangelist with Salt Security. It's been a little bit of a journey to get to that point. I won't bore listeners with my complete history, but I kind of rose up the ranks doing a lot of systems engineering work with a major telco, Verizon, and then eventually switched into application security work, and at some point transitioned to analyst work. I was a former Gartner analyst covering the application security space, including things like API security and DevOps practices, and some aspects of infrastructure security. And eventually that kind of led to where I am now with Salt Security. And I just kind of promote awareness around API security challenges of deep technical complexity, right? Because it is kind of a complex topic.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that's kind of where I am today.
Fabulous. That sounds good. So our systems and our platforms today are largely driven by API integrations, vis-a-vis like we've got an API economy now. And a lot of these applications today come with APIs that allow extensibility and integration capabilities and things like that. Let's take a step back and start with a governance question first. Who owns API security in an organization? Michael, is it the CIO, the CTO, CISO, somebody else? Any thoughts on that?
It's a great question, and it's to me it's a little bit like who owned application security or who owns it, because I would see this a lot when I would talk to organizations of all sizes and across industries. A lot of companies don't even have application security teams, unfortunately, right? So it's like who's owning application security pieces. You also see that with API security. The difference is like API security is kind of a superset of many things, right? You have application components, you have infrastructure components, network elements, identity and access management. There's a lot to it. So I'd say typically what we find is API security is owned by quite a few stakeholders in the organization. Like certainly network engineering owns pieces of it with load balancers, maybe they're operating API gateways. That could be in scope for API product teams. But I'd say it's probably more common that security is actually owned by maybe CIO office, right? If you kind of go up that food chain, and maybe less so with CISO. All right, I certainly was common that for a security organization, they might not be as versed on application concepts, and by extension, that's going to include APIs. So they might actually push some of that, like as part of shift left, for instance, push some of that responsibility onto the application teams. So I'd say more commonly, it probably falls on kind of the CIO side of things.
That's great. And ultimately, when we look at technology, and that includes DevOps teams, we've got configuration management, we've got operations. So the technology itself ultimately supports the business strategy. Can you talk a little bit about some compelling arguments to convince a business stakeholder of the need to invest in API security? Because we're hearing a lot more of this. We've invested in security. We're not sure we're getting what we're looking for from a security perspective in terms of the confidence or the assurance. So how do you start that conversation to make this sort of compelling case that we really do need to invest in security? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, certainly. It's probably a topic I think about often, right? Like how do we kind of dissect this complex topic and make it appealing to the business, right? Because that's the heart of it, right? Businesses have to make money. So how do you pitch security? I'd say a mode of thinking that's kind of gaining a lot of traction, and we saw some of this in the recent executive order with the Biden administration, where they talk about the concepts of supply chains. You mentioned this as we started talking, right? Like the API landscape is very large, right? It's a very diverse ecosystem where we are integrating with systems and applications, but we also work with a lot of partners and suppliers. Like that's just kind of the nature of most modes of business, right? You're rarely doing everything yourself. You're working with other services and providers. That forms a very complex digital supply chain. We've seen a lot of supply chain attacks, right? Or cyber attacks, you might say more broadly. But in a lot of cases, they're actually targeting APIs, right? If it's not wholly an API that they are taking advantage of, that might be the initial attack vector, right? And then they pivot from there. So I mean, APIs are kind of the heart of it, right? And I would have said this even prior to joining SALT, right? It is kind of my primary mission right now to promote awareness around APIs, but it's been that kind of trajectory, right? I'd say the better part of 10 years where APIs give you that flexibility to integrate and create these digital supply chains that have a lot of benefits. But for organizations, right, the need to invest in some kind of API security capability, exposing some of those issues with the digital supply chains, that complexity, how do you get visibility into it, right? I'd say in a lot of cases today, it might be more of a paper exercise, like trying to assess all your suppliers and getting attestation. That's just not going to cut it, right? Because ultimately it does get very much into a technology problem, like how are your suppliers and partners integrating things? And then how does that impact your risk? Right, so I'd say what we commonly see is organizations are a little flying blind in a sense there, right? They don't necessarily know at a technical level what are my exposures, and it also expands, right? It's not just how APIs might be attacked as regulation kind of gets rewritten or new regulations coming, right? Particularly in the space of privacy. Like the things you need to be concerned about as an organization, it starts to grow, right? So even exposing some piece of data that you are doing to facilitate your business could now subject you to certain types of regulation.
That's interesting. There's so much that you mentioned there. Digital, you talked about the supply chain, you talked about privacy, and with a lot of organizations today on this trajectory towards becoming digital, considering that a core part of creating these integrated pipelines is in fact driven through APIs, it becomes a necessary part of trying to enable digital delivery at the end of the day. So as the business is evolving towards a digital delivery model, the enabler for that happens to be the APIs underneath all of this. And if we don't secure the APIs, then you end up with a situation where it's difficult to try and demonstrate that within these pipelines, nothing has in fact been tampered with as you're going through these pipelines that now cut across different organizations as we consider the supply chain, as you'd mentioned. It's a fascinating topic. I mean, that could be an hour's discussion right there, Michael, honestly, but great response. When you think about securing APIs, you've had these conversations multiple times. If you could just sort of look at the broad categories of challenges that you see, could you share what some of these biggest challenges are around securing our APIs?
Yeah, certainly. So I mean, I touched on kind of the partner and suppliers, right? That's your third parties, third party dependencies, you might say, and actually, I'd say a lot of focus on software supply chains and digital supply chains is kind of on componentry, right? Like those are your application dependencies, and you might pull those into your code. There's also API dependencies, obviously, right? Because we're talking about invoking APIs to consume that functionality or data. Then we repurpose that, right? That's kind of how we architect modern applications. So those partner and supplier integrations it can become a really complex spider web. That's the digital supply chain. The other thing is, right, kind of as organizations are building applications, typically they are API centric, right? There's a lot of discussion around microservices and microservices architecture. APIs are usually tied very closely at the hip to that, right?
Mhm.
Because as you build microservices where you want this thing to just do one thing, right? It's responsible for one function, and then that might kind of put you on this trajectory to containerized architectures and Kubernetes and all those great things. But the way you expose microservice functionality to other microservices, or maybe end users or employees, you use APIs to do that, right? So as design patterns have evolved into microservices architecture, and I'd say even cloud native design, you end up with kind of this explosion of a lot of APIs, right? And some of them might be inner, right? Things that traditionally might be in your data center, but as organizations shift towards cloud, you can't necessarily rely on traditional data center controls, right? Typically, that's something perimeter based. I'm going to block access at the network perimeter. Now that it exists in the cloud, right? And things become much more distributed because that provides you resiliency, right? And scalability and elasticity, all those great things that are going to help kind of power the business. So there's quite a few, I'd say, variables in play that kind of complicate the API landscape. And then, by extension of that, how do you secure it all, right? So it's the tooling that we as practitioners had that maybe 10 years ago, it's just not built for this world, right? It's if things were kind of isolated in a data center, you might be able to get away with just deploying a WAF in front of that. But it's just things are too distributed. Attacks have also kind of changed, right? They're not just simple exploits, right? Where you're going to try to maybe inject something to siphon out data from a backend SQL database, right? Or perform like a reflected script, like cross-site scripting attack that in the application security space is very common. And in the API security space, it's much more about kind of abusing business logic, right? Or scraping data, right? So an API might function exactly as you intended, but somebody is going to misuse that, right? And repurpose data in a way that you just don't want. So the traditional kind of security approaches, network access controls, locking down perimeters, even some WAFs, right? Because they're built to kind of protect more traditional web applications, not necessarily the API traffic that might flow within that, right? Or API sequences. So it's kind of a mixture of all these things, right? The evolution of application design patterns and infrastructure, but then also how attacks have evolved.
Yeah, interesting. You brought up the idea of a perimeter-based security model and how that's evolving as we consider applications in the cloud, for example. And one of the things that's emerged, I mean, there's some history behind this, but as of right now, a lot of discussions around zero trust to try and shift away from an exclusively perimeter-driven kind of security model. Can you talk a little bit about API security in the context of zero trust and these newer security models, these evolving security models?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm definitely familiar with zero trust. I mean, I used to get the question pretty frequently. Within the context, I'd say, of containerized architectures, it started to kind of reemerge there. Probably, honestly, in good part to Google pushing that, right, with Beyond Corp and Beyond Trust, or Beyond. I mixed up the names. Beyond Corp and Beyond Prod, I think, was the second one that kind of followed that up. But Beyond Corp was kind of it definitely borrowed heavily from zero trust principles, right? And they predate Google, certainly. But if you have to kind of boil down what does zero trust mean, it's kind of you can't trust the operating environment, right? And it could be compromised in any given moment. So any user or machine, when it attempts to access something, you have to kind of question, should this be allowed, and then kind of take some action on that. I'd say what has happened in practice is you have to kind of look at behavior analysis engines, right? Because traditional access controls are much more about, we're going to lock down this perimeter. It's a static access control list. This thing can't talk to this thing, right? You have very structured networks. When we talk about kind of cloud native design patterns and things being more distributed, that architecture is much more ephemeral, right? You're not necessarily going to have a fixed IP address space. So like traditional like network identifying characteristics, just they don't exist, right? Or they're changing too rapidly. So the newer technologies that are based on zero trust principles will start to pair in kind of identity layer, right? So what is the authenticated context of this user or machine? Should they be authorized to do this? Do we need to re-challenge for authentication? And that network perimeter has kind of, it's shifted, right? Because it's not necessarily existing at a data center perimeter. You kind of have more like micro perimeters, for lack of a better term, right? Like maybe it's just around this set of workloads or these sets of functions. And the technology that probably maps closest to that is microsegmentation technologies. So you're kind of moving away from these big monolithic network perimeters to something that's likely more software based. And then where you enforce that, it might be an agent, it might be a hypervisor, it could be the container runtime. But now you want to start to isolate how things can talk to one another. Hopefully that kind of answers part of your question, Altaz. It's kind of hard to dissect the zero trust thing. And I'd say within API context, what we see with some organizations that are more mature in their API security approach is those technologies like microsegmentation, and if you are knee deep in zero trust, maybe you're looking at zero trust network access. Not all of them apply to API use cases, because typically, like maybe you're building a public API or open API, or it needs to allow anonymous access. How do you restrict network access, right? It needs to be open. So sometimes those technologies don't really help greatly. But what we see sometimes with mature organizations is they do use the behavior analysis engines of API security tooling to kind of parse the context of what's happening, right? What should those API call sequences look like? What is a normal baseline? And then when we start to deviate from that, maybe it's a malicious user or machine entity. Well, now we can kind of call back to those network-based mechanisms, whether it's microsegmentation, maybe it is just kind of a load balancer, right? Application delivery controller, API gateway, you name it, right? It's kind of any network-based proxy. I might want to start to restrict connectivity based on how somebody is consuming APIs.
Yeah, it makes sense. And so there's some work actually being done within the industry right now. The Open Group's working on some stuff. NIST is working on some stuff. As we start as a community to produce some guidance around zero trust and getting to the operational elements of zero trust. Michael, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's been awesome, Altaz. Thanks for having me on.
Want to learn about what Security Compass has to offer? Check out securitycompass.com/demo for a free demo today. Want more of the balancing act? Be sure to subscribe to our channel wherever you listen to podcasts for more episodes.